Welcome back, you Pete patrons. After the last review where I reviewed the 2022 Laphroaig Cairdeas, I wanted to dig out another dusty bottle from my shelf that I've been keeping for a lot of years. It's another Cairdeas release, and hopefully it's one that will be a nice little contrast comparison to the whiskey that we've just reviewed. Anyone recognise that? I'm sure that a few of you tried that, because there's a lot of excitement about this one when it was actually available. And it was actually sold by ballot, which was not that common. I think this was about 8 years ago when this was put on sale, because there was a huge demand for it, and they felt that this was one of the first ones that Laphroaig had to sell by ballot because there's just too much demand. So a lot of you are instantly going to recognise this as an old Cairdeas, because back in the day they used to have a solid lump of colour on the lower kind of 40% of the tube. This one is green because this is the Laphroaig 2015. What did they call this one? They didn't really. It just says Cairdeas 200th anniversary for the Friends of Laphroaig. So this is also, as you can see up here, commemorative of the 200th anniversary of Laphroaig, which happened in 2015, with the distillery not really being founded, but kind of they had to go official and legitimate because the taxman caught them back in 1815. So this was a very special Cairdeas, not only because it is a Cairdeas and all Cairdeas releases are special, but because of that anniversary, they decided that with this one they wouldn't do any wacky out there wine cask finish or anything like that. They were going to give the fans of Laphroaig a true Laphroaig. And it is a little bit deja vu on this one, because I think that they have kind of recycled their idea for this one in the 2022 Cairdeas release, because it's very, very similar, at least on paper. So let's go over some of the details that they give us for this 2015 Cairdeas. Like this year's Cairdeas release, it is matured in 100% first fill Maker's Mark bourbon casks. This one, back when it was available, actually sold with a ballot system, as I mentioned, for about £65, which in hindsight seems like a really, really fair price for a Cairdeas release, bearing in mind that they're selling for kind of £85–90 these days. Another thing that really got me really excited about this one, even more so than this year's Cairdeas, is that this one, they said that it's made with 100% malt from the actual malting floors at Laphroaig. So there's no barley gone into this that was malted at the Port Ellen maltings. It's all, if you've been to Laphroaig and done the tour, you'll have seen the floor maltings there. 100% of the barley that goes into this is from those old-fashioned floor maltings. I do wonder if the Cairdeas 2022 might have been the same deal, or maybe they realised that it wasn't really worth it and they decided to use the Port Ellen maltings for the 2022. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any differences there. Another thing that they did with this one that they didn't say in the 2022 is that they used the smaller stills that they have at Laphroaig for this one. So in theory, those smaller stills should give a more robust, more hearty, more flavourful, slightly rougher and ballsier type of spirit. Another really interesting thing with this 2015 Cairdeas that they didn't mention with the new one is that unofficially they told us that this one it doesn't have an age statement like most Cairdeases don't, but this one they said unofficially that it's around about an 11 to 12 year old whiskey. So in theory it should be slightly older than the average expression from the standard 10 or the 10 cask strength. Like most Cairdeases, it's bottled just over 50% ABV, this one being bottled in 2015 at 51.5% ABV. As I mentioned in the previous video, the ABV on a lot of these Cairdeas releases, not all but a lot of them, they put the last 2 digits of the year as the last 2 digits of the ABV, which in and of itself probably tells you that it's almost certainly not cask strength. This one here on the back of the tube, and I think the label as well, I'll give you a close-up of the tube on this one so that you can hit pause and have a read if it ever comes into focus. But the back is probably the interesting bit. Hopefully that's going to come into focus for you. does actually say low down on the start of the second paragraph in the green. It says non-chill filtered. So I don't know how Laphroaig have managed to do that they've actually not bothered to filter this, and they've actually been able to tell us, because it seems like it's incredibly hard to do for them to actually say that it's non-chill filtered on the tube. I don't know why, but it's obviously a real technical challenge, but they've told us that this one is non-chill filtered. Sadly, it doesn't say anywhere, as far as I can see, that it's natural colour, but as you'll see when I get some of this in the glass, like this year's Cairdeas, it is a very, very pale Laphroaig, and I think that it probably is natural colour. Just interesting here, I'll show you the lid on this one. I've kept this one on my shelf for 8 years, and I think you can tell it's a wee bit dusty. So another really interesting thing on this one, the bottle that they used for this 200th anniversary Laphroaig, I get the feeling that they were pushing the fact that it was natural colour, even though they didn't say, because unusually for Laphroaig, it's in clear glass. So that's a real rarity. There are not many Laphroaig releases that don't come in the dark green glass. It's a real rare release from Laphroaig, because you very, very rarely see that. And I will also show you something else I find interesting, probably boring some of you, but if you look at the bottom floor of the bottle in there, this has been on my shelf for 8 years or thereabouts, and hopefully you can see there's a bit of dusty stuff settled out, a little bit of sediment in the whisky there. And as I've said before, and as you all know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is a mark of quality. But really nice that they've done it in that clear glass, so we can see that, you'd hope, natural colour, or at least reasonably natural colour. So, like I said, this one is technically, on paper, theoretically very similar to this year's 2022 Cairdeas release. There's just a few things that they haven't done with this year's Cairdeas, and it might just be that they have done them but they've not bothered to tell us. Things like, in particular, I'm thinking about the fact that they used the floor malted barley in this one, whereas they didn't say in the 2022, and the fact that they guarantee that this one is non-chill filtered, whereas again they didn't tell us in the 2022. But will be interesting to see any changes that may have happened with the Laphroaig house style in those 8 years, and any differences that we might be able to see from the fact that this is a floor malted barley Laphroaig Cairdeas. So let's get some in the glass, see what we've got. Also, I can't remember, let's see what sort of cork they've given us on this one. So that's your usual sort of pressed cork crumbs, composite crappy cork. But to be fair, this one's been on my shelf for a really long time. I do occasionally tip my bottles to wet the cork. I've probably put all the sediment into suspension there, but never mind. I do occasionally wet the cork. And that one, despite being a crappy composite cork, it was intact when I opened it. So no problems there. So luckily my 2015 Cairdeas has survived the last 8 years on the shelf. Let's see if it's any good. So straight away, beautiful, lovely Laphroaig flavours that you always expect from a Laphroaig bourbon matured Cairdeas. And at least broadly speaking, there are a lot of similarities there between this and this year's Cairdeas. Getting lots of rich caramel oak on the nose, and a really nice peppery oaky edge. I may be wrong, I may be thinking about something else, but I think when they came out with this 2015 Cairdeas, they talked about the casks that went into it being air seasoned. So the casks, those first fill Maker's Mark casks, were actually stripped down and left to season in the sun. I think that was this one that they said that about. But you can definitely tell that there's a nice toasted oak, peppery oak spice note to the nose of this, which I think is something that I pointed out on the 2022 Cairdeas as well. Nice saltiness on the nose, also getting some really nice sweet and light TCP and iodine notes. Now, it's not a massive peat bomb, especially for a Laphroaig. There's lots of peatiness there, but I think that compared to the cask strength releases and even the core Laphroaig releases, the phenolics are probably toned down a little bit in this one. There are some very strange, curious, unusual notes on the nose of this Cairdeas though. I'm getting a slightly acetic quality, so slightly vinegary. And before any of you ask, none of these are really a flaw in this whisky, I don't think. They're just interesting little complexities. Also getting a kind of sweet Parma violet note on the nose. And there's another sweet and acrid note in there that I spent quite a long time nosing this, trying to figure out what it reminded me of. And I think what I'm smelling on the nose of this one is just a background note, but it's always there. There's kind of a fiberglass note. And I don't mean finished fiberglass, I mean when they're making fiberglass parts and they're actually pressing the fiberglass into the moulds. That wet fiberglass resin kind of smell. So acrid, plasticky notes, probably something that I'd more associate with Ardbeg, and that they're not really present in this to the extent that I normally find them in Ardbeg, but that's a really nice, characterful, interesting note. And I don't know if I mentioned before, but there's a lovely, real strong malted barley gristy note to the nose of this as well. And I absolutely love it when you can smell the barley in a whisky. So I'm getting sidetracked now because the nose of this is just that lovely. Let's see how it tastes. I think you can really taste the extra age on this one. I do suspect that the 2022 Cairdeas is probably slightly less than 10 years old. Not by much, but a bit. I think with this one, you can tell that it's had those 11-12 years, and I think it possibly tastes a little bit older than that as well. On the palate I'm getting a really lovely sweet and nuttiness, nutty maltiness, and they're kind of surprising old malt notes that you wouldn't normally expect even in a whisky that's 12 years old. I think that some of that oily, nutty maltiness, it's the kind of thing that I'd expect in a whisky that's more along the lines of 15, perhaps 16 years old. Also getting more of that lovely, sweet, warming vanilla peat that I always get on all the Laphroaigs. There's a little bit of a sawdust quality and some slightly bitter oak tannins, but not to the point where it's a problem. I think that this one is got in common with the 2022 Cairdeas that there's some lovely toasted oak, slightly dry oaky notes that are they're just the right amount. It's never so much that it's a problem. Let's have another sip. Beautiful natural looking colour there. So again on the palate, a slight pepperiness, peppery wood spice, toasted oak. There's definitely a brininess to this one, because I think this one was also matured in warehouse number 1. Yeah, warehouse number 1 next to the sea. So really is a very similar description on paper to the 2022 Cairdeas. And I think that you can tell, whether you believe or not, that the maritime sea air permeates the cask and actually introduces saltiness. I think it does, but I don't think that's the whole picture. I think other things give a salinity and a brininess to a whisky apart from sea air, but there's definitely that briny maritime quality to this. I'm also getting it's quite a fatty, oily whisky. It's got a really good body to it, and it's got some really sort of robust, greasy notes to it. I'm also getting quite a note of mint on the late palate of this whisky. There's a definite almost menthol mintiness to this whisky, and that's something else that I really like in small quantities in a whisky. And I think that oily fattiness mixed with that hint of mint actually reminds me a little bit of the Ardbeg fermentation, which if you've seen my video you'll know that I'm a massive fan of. Let's have one more sip and look at the finish. It's curious that now I'm thinking about it and looking for it, there are some similarities between this and the fermentation. Lots of notes that just remind me of that bottling. And I love the fermentation. But as for the finish on this one, longish and lingering, but slightly gentle, which is something that I said on the 2022 Cairdeas 4 as well. Lots of maltiness, lots of toasted oak, smokiness, wood smoke, and slightly dry. So as for a grade for this Cairdeas 2015 release, I was originally going to go for a B+, which is the same grade that I gave this year's Cairdeas, but the more I taste this, the more I like it. The more you look at this whiskey, the more flavours there are to pick out. I think it's kind of nice in a way that with like the Laphroaig 10 Cairdeas and this year's Cairdeas and this old Cairdeas, you've kind of got a sliding scale where, like with the 10-year-old cask strength, you've got maximum power, but probably not quite as much complexity as you want. With this year's Cairdeas, you've got a little bit less power and a bit more complexity. With this one, I think those lines cross over. It's really all about the complexity at the cost of a little bit more of that power. So if you're looking for a cerebral Laphroaig Cairdeas, I think this is a really good one. Although, as is the case with the 2022 Cairdeas, it's still got enough power. It's not an underpowered whiskey. So going back to what grade I would give with this, I'm actually going to take it up a notch. I'm going to give this one an A-. So I did try this one back in 2015 when it came out, but I decided to get a second bottle and keep this on my shelf, and I'm really glad that I did. And I almost wish that I'd tried a little bit harder and tried to find a third bottle of this, because I really like this stuff, and it's not easy to get this kind of expression from Laphroaig anymore. Now that they've discontinued the 18, which, to be fair, had some problems, and they've discontinued the 15 as well. You can get the 16, I think, although I think that's an Amazon exclusive, so there's problems there if you're not a fan of giving money to Jeff. So this one, I'm probably going to try and make this one last quite a while, which is the main reason why the fill level in this one hasn't gone down as much as it has on the 2022 Cairdeas that I've released, because I'm trying to savour this one. So will I be going out onto the secondary market and trying to source another bottle of this at an inflated price, most likely? Honestly, no. This is a really good whiskey, and you're probably completely out of luck if you want to find this now, unless you want to pay through the nose. But in my opinion, there are plenty more great whiskies out there that I would rather seek out new experiences and try those new whiskies rather than make someone rich by buying their dusty old bottles that they've hoarded just in order to flip. I think that this is a really great whiskey. I know that it was probably a little bit divisive because a lot of people weren't a fan of this Cairdeas release. If you have a look on Whisky Base, I think there's some people on there saying that this is the weakest Cairdeas that they've had. I don't agree with that at all. I like my straightforward bourbon matured peated Scotch, and I think this is a really good example of that. But in terms of available, affordable whiskey, the 2022 Cairdeas is, in my opinion, slightly inferior, but a very similar level of quality to this. In short, they're both fantastic whiskies, and so are lots of other available releases out there. Let me know what you thought of this one, if you had it, if you can remember this one, or if you've got tasting notes from it, and what do you think of the Cairdeas releases in general. Thanks for watching, and cheers.